And here we go, gentlemen. Here we go. Another episode of Sales Chatter with our main man, the mad scientist, and data, Dean Crook. And today we're going to talk about RFP season. It is here. What are we going to do? What's the data telling us? And how can we perform at our highest and land the most RFPs?
To the HPLS podcast. Live, relevant, and high performance information, conversations, and education weekly.
Gents, this is one of my favorite conversations because I've got a real love-hate relationship with RFPs. I don't know about you guys, but for me, RFPs were always that, oh my God, I am going to make so much money this year with this RFP. And it was like that holy grail of business that I never got. Right. Like you're always in the lead, and then always the incumbents or somebody get the business because it's like, and then you start thinking it's a way to keep the incumbents honest and like, oh man, but I remember doing like 10, 20 RFPs one year. And I thought for sure the next year, like I'm buying my Ferrari, I'm buying my mansion, this was early in my career, obviously, when it was all about the money. And I was like, that's it, man. Like I got 20 RFPs, and like I got Coke, and I got like Levi jeans, and I got like you guys are just, I'm going to blow you guys all the way. And then the next year I'm still struggling making sales calls. And it was, they're such a pain in the ass, but yet they're so cool to do them. And there's this energy that comes with them, right? And then I remember for years I struggled with RFPs, and then I came up with a system where I would really qualify the customer for RFPs, and I actually started winning them, which was even a lot more fun. I don't know if that's English, but we'll have to check that out later. But it was so amazing when you it works. It was so amazing when you actually start winning some. So Dean, I'm excited to hear what the data is going to tell us about RFPs, my man. I'm so excited.
Yes.
Well, I'm super glad we've been able to get Jeff on the show also this week, because I think he'll be able to complement some of the things we're seeing from the data perspective with the reality. There's a few things that are very different this year, right? And so Dan, do you think everybody knows what RFPs mean and what the season means?
You know what? Why don't we set the baseline, Dean? So why don't you dive into the RFP? Typically, when the data shows the season of RFPs, what they're meant for, and if people do, then great. Maybe it's just a reminder. But if people don't, it's really important that they understand this.
Yeah, I was just thinking of some of the newer folks to the industry, because I have this conversation with truckers a lot. They'll say, well, what's contract freight? How does that get determined? What's spot rate? So really, essentially right now, if you said 90% of all loads on trucks are moving on contract rates, the other 10% will be moving on spot. And of course, the difference between the two is primarily the lead time, the pickup time. Spot market rate is determined on the day of. It's what the market will bear, depending on supply and demand. Whereas contract rates are really established sometimes a year in advance. There are certainly the rates that will be in TMS systems and what we call routing guides in January next year are being determined now. And it's through this request for proposal process, or colloquially known as bid season. And I was at a bid season event Monday, and it was a really interesting event where the big shipper got all of their large carriers in to have a discussion about what they expect in the upcoming bid, the bid season, which could take 2 to 3 months when you go out. When the shipper says, here's all my lanes I run, here's how many loads on each lane I'd like to ship, and we want you to commit to capacity on those lanes. And it's not like it's a contract in the true sense of the word, because the carrier can accept or reject those loads, depending on whether they've got a truck, they don't want to go there, there's too many deadhead miles. There's like a million reasons. Well, not a million, but there's a lot. Sure. So what we saw last year was the contract loads were being rejected about a quarter of the time, about 25% of the time, by carriers who agreed in the prior year to haul those loads. Mm-hmm. And the reason is there was better opportunities on the spot market because the rates were higher than what they bid the year before. Refrigerated loads, on the other hand, you could see easily half of those rejected every single day out of Joplin, for example. From now until Thanksgiving, when all the fresh turkeys are going to start moving, you'll be hard pressed to find a refrigerated trailer to do fresh turkeys. So the contract rates that the carriers bid on, I've seen rejection rates of up around 53-60%. So flatbed's a little bit the same. Flatbed rejection rates on contract loads are similar. The difference with flatbed is more of it moves on spot, because it's a lot of one-way destination project type work where there couldn't have been a rate determined a year ago because it was a building that's just popping up, and you've got a lot of deadhead miles. So it's a
Dean,
spot.
I've got a question on that, if you don't mind. Sorry to interrupt. So a company that would spend a lot, because RFPs cost a lot of money, like especially if you get like a Blue Jay system or somebody involved, right?
Yeah.
Because companies, they'll do the RFP for you, but it's like 80, 90 grand in some cases to put this RFP on, which is a huge chunk out of your logistics budget.
Yeah.
And why would a company continue to do an RFP if they're like 50% rejection? Does it worth it for the other 50% to haul with no headaches? Or like, what's the balance?
It's a good
there?
question.
That seems to me like a lot.
It's a great question. Jeff, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, they kind of agree to something that they can't agree on, if that makes any sense.
Right. Yeah.
So what happens in their contractual agreement is that they're saying they're going to take X amount of loads over a period of time, right? However, the market changes, contract changes within that period of time. And then they go back and they look at their operating ratio. And then they finally say, we can't sustain this. Boom. All of a sudden, they start dropping off the loads and they start going to more profitable loads. But then again, what does that do between the shipper and the carrier? Right? They fall.
I wouldn't use them again.
Oh, exactly.
If I was a shipper and I agreed to something where I said, and here's the flip side of it. This is what I need from A to B. Here's my parameters. You give me a price. Now, if I knock you down, and kick you while you're down, I should expect that when something more profitable comes, you'll take it, because you said $1,500 and I said 1,000 and we agreed on 1,050. That's not a partnership. That's a dictatorship. So there's one side of it, which I do see a lot of RFPs go that way, right? Oh, you finished round one, but you're 4% off. So, it's.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is that, to me anyway, what I'm seeing, there's no real long-term RFPs that we used to have many years ago, where we would lock them in for a year, sometimes two, believe it or not, to lock long-term contracts. I'm seeing more short-term because of the volatility in the market.
I have a feeling that's where Dean was going right after that comment was the short term. Yeah.
Exactly. So you say, okay, listen, let's lock them in for 3 months. We'll reevaluate. We'll look at the fuel, because the fuel is always a moving market, right? That's uncontrollable. Nobody knows where it's going to go. However, if the sales rep is really good at what they do and they can predict, they kind of put a buffer in that over a period of time with expectations that the market's going to do X and it may do Y, just to cover their butts, right? So I try to reevaluate with my customers and clients every 3 months rather than a year, because first of all, you're building that business relationship with them. You're keeping them up to speed on the market, what's happening there, every month as well. And they always say, listen, there's a lot of shippers out there that watch the data, that look at the spot market, that look at the contracts, that buy in, right? So they know what's going on as well. So you can't BS them, right? But they also realize that you, as a broker, right, or a business service provider, have to make money as well. So it's all taken into consideration. And what's really funny, and I started laughing at the beginning of this, is that I am working on 201 lanes, 794 loads monthly, and I have to finish it up by the end of the week, and I started it last week. Wow. And I'm going over with my partner because I've got everything in place. I did all the calculations, everything. And that's why I started laughing when you said about 3 months. I don't have 3 months to do that.
So let me answer the question also this way, Dan. One of the first slides the shipper put up was the carrier's compliance ratio, which was the percentage of loads they accepted. And then they put all their names, all of their acceptance ratios, and then the benchmark for the company overall. So when you come to the bidding process and the negotiating process, if you haven't played well and rejected a lot of loads, it's there for everybody to see. So one of the reasons, of course, you go to the market to get an RFP in place is to improve your service levels. So carriers know that there's a compromise between service levels and the rate that they charge. So I think the point I was going to make about what's different this season, typically, and again, this is coming from DAT's shipper side of our business, which is about 40% of our business, and some of the very large,
which is huge for everyone.
Yeah,
everyone watching.
It's a decent
massive.
sample.
Yeah.
Right. So what they're seeing is that when there's rebidding going on as a result of capacity loosening, so rebidding of contracts, seeing 8 to 12% reduction in freight rates once the contract is rebid. So rates are coming down. Contract rates have certainly peaked. But the big difference this year, when we talk to all of our shippers and we compile some of the major themes, last year, as Jeff mentioned, there was lots of mini bids, short-term capacity contracts on more dense, core, important lanes. Whereas, so normally in an RFP, you said, how many lanes was it, Jeff? 200 lanes?
201 lanes.
So I wonder what percentage of volume moves on 20% of those lanes. Like, is it evenly spread?
Well, I've got all those numbers. I mean,
okay.
Because they had the analytics, and so
Yeah.
I asked for them, and they gave it, which helps me out a lot,
Yeah,
especially
okay,
in the
good.
negotiation side of it, right?
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
that'll
So
work.
what we found is when we looked at all the RFPs, there's about 30% of lanes, what we call ghost lanes, no freight ever eventuated.
Yep.
And there's a very heavy concentration ratio around a lot of volume moves on a small number of lanes for some of these very large shippers on sort of these major origin destination pairs. So normally they'd go out with, let's say, 1,000 lanes, and that's everything they do, whether it's 1 load a week or 100 loads a week. And they ask the carriers to bid, and just imagine a spreadsheet with all the carriers' names, all the lanes, and their cheapest rate to move the loads on that lane at 100 loads a week. So they have this routing guide that sort of, it cascades from the cheapest rate to the most expensive rate. And as loads get rejected at the top of the routing guide, it falls to the next expensive carrier and so on.
Yep,
it's called the
exactly.
waterfall concept. And then eventually it'll flow out into the spot market because no one wants to take it for a variety of reasons. So there's this, so what we've seen this year versus last year is last year shippers went to all the carriers with all their lanes to get a cheaper rate. That's the general process. This year, it's very, very different. They're going to fewer carriers with just the high volume lanes, and they're letting the 1 and 2 loads a week flow right to the non-asset brokers and carriers in the spot market, because it's not worth, Dan mentioned the cost of doing an RFP. It's not worth the cost for 1 load a week to have it in a routing guide, because you're almost guaranteeing a rejection, because the chances of a carrier having a truck in that spot at that time is fairly low. So the big difference this year is that shippers in our consortium are sticking with their incumbent carriers, but here's the difference: they're going to fewer carriers, sticking with their incumbents who played well during the last market cycle, but giving them more volume. This is it's a big distinction. So they're sticking with their carriers that partnered well, had high acceptance rates of contract loads through the TMS systems, who were good partners and who agreed to higher service levels for higher rates in the last 18 months, because that was one of the conditions shippers said: if you want more rates, double-digit rate increases, you better make sure you accept all of our loads. Now, I'm sure they didn't accept all of them. So going deeper. Now, of course, you could offer a better rate to a shipper by having more volume, because you get more lane density, more revenue per tractor week, more revenue per. So it doesn't mean. And of course, the carriers, when I was explaining this, were horrified that there was someone saying that contract rates are coming down, which they are. And again, this is their data. Our DAT's data comes from loads moved that carriers agree to move the load at. We don't set the rate. We don't have any trucks. So I was presenting back what's happening in the trend, and of course this contract negotiation goes on, and it can get very contentious, because the shipper wants cost reductions, more efficiency, higher service levels, more lane density. And then the carriers, of course, are saying, hey, our operating costs have gone up 25 cents a mile in the last year. Diesel just went up 20 cents a gallon this week. So there's a very serious negotiation process going on in what we call bid season. It's underway, and it's where the loads that are going to move next year are being determined. The rate they're moving next year are being determined right now, as Jeff is doing with one of his customers this week.
Yeah. And it's all part of that, building that relationship and being open about, hey, I got to take an increase. If you have a smart shipper, they're watching the market as well, as long as it's justifiable. It's when issues happen when it's unjustifiable and you can't justify why you want to take an increase, right?
Right.
And to get to your point, Dean, about the volumes, that's the way that I used to run it as well. When we had $50 million, $60 million worth of freight, we used to have 18 carriers. So we basically consolidated them, increased the revenue, right? And then got better discounts on that because we gave them volume on that. But a lot of the shippers out there, as you mentioned with the TMS system, they have a lot of the big ones have KPIs in place. And one of the biggest ones is the rejection part of the tendering. And then this way, when they have their round table with their carriers, like I did, we can call them out. And there's things of, there's exceptions and then there's non-exceptions. The act of gods are an exception where you take that into consideration and you won't hold that against the carrier because you have no control. But transmission going down or flat because they didn't change out their, those are unacceptable, right? So those are the things that we used to drill into. I used to drill into power units and how failure. So there's so many different things on the tendering process and the rejection process that you can look into besides what you're mentioning right now.
Right. It must be a tough time for shippers, right? Because in the post-ELD era, you've got, I'd imagine, more service failures because of hours now, because the driver can run out of hours on either their 14 or their 60, be forced to take a 34 before they can get delivered. So I'd imagine that's much more difficult these days than ever before. So, and that's really where we're at. The other thing is that I mentioned earlier that contract rates have peaked and starting to drop. We're seeing refrigerated and dry van rates. So remember we talked about the TMS routing guide, right? That guide with a list of all the carriers. The new rates that are entering routing guides based on RFPs that were worked on a few months ago are coming in about 5 to 6% lower in the last 2 weeks compared to the prior 2 weeks. So remember, spot rates started to tank in March this year. They've dropped about 86 cents a mile since then. That's the line haul spot excluding fuel. So they've come way down. Now, what happens is they create a drag effect on contract rates within about 4 to 6 months. We typically say contract rates follow spot rates on a 4 to 6 month lag. So in March, contract rates started to come way down really rapidly. They've dropped about 30% since then. Contract rates, new rates entering routing guides. So the pool of rates in our routing guides are kind of flat, peaking and flat, but new rates coming in are 5% lower. So it means that contract rates are starting to follow spot rates down on that curve in August, when spot rates really started to turn in March. That gives you an idea of, and if you go back and look at 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, you'll see this same lag effect where the two follow each other, but on different amplitude and different sort of cadence. The challenge this time around, it's a really interesting market, is how low will contract rates go, given that diesel prices have forced up operating costs for carriers by so much. And one of the things I've seen in the spot market, and why we are reasonably bullish about spot rates, plateauing shortly and increasing through the rest of the year, is because there's a cost plus pricing mentality going on in the spot market. And I think carriers have realized that if diesel's at 75 cents per mile, we need cost recovery on that. Now, the thing, I talked to owner-operators and small fleets in the spot market who really never paid much attention to the fuel surcharge piece. They weren't aware of it because when you get a brokered spot load, it's an all-in rate. It doesn't pass out all of your accessorials. It's just a load rate. And suddenly the cost of fuel really started to hit everybody in the hip pocket. and they said, "Hey, we can't afford to run our truck. I can't fill the tank up today. It's too expensive to run. We need to get full cost recovery." So rather than the market sort of determining the rate, market forces, carriers I found were taking a more of a cost plus mentality to make sure they got the rate they needed. Now, what that did, and we talked about this on the show last year, it created a new floor price as to how low rates would go. And even when we look at our 12-month rate forecasts, the worst case scenario is still higher than 2018, 2019 low points. So because there's a new cost base to operate a truck fleet, because driver wages are up, diesel's up. So those of you that are bidding and talking to shippers, there's a new floor price in terms of what it costs to run heavy equipment today. And I think that's got to be an important part of the discussion as you go forward, because you cannot be thinking that 2019 rates are going to return. Or 17 or 16. Those days have sort of disappeared a bit. And
it's like fuel, right?
This week is alarming.
No. Do you remember when fuel was in Canada, below $1 a liter? Then fuel went to $1 a liter, and everybody was like, "Oh my God, they're freaking out." Then it went up to $1.20, and then dropped to $1.10. They're like, "Oh my God, it's $1.10. It's so cheap." And that's, I think, the mentality that we have to get when it comes to pricing this year. If you're running a lane. And it's kind of twofold though, Dean. So it's interesting because spot rates are higher than they've ever been, even in 2018, which we said was that kind of benchmark year. But I had a conversation with a customer of mine who has a average size brokerage. He's got about 12 guys working for him. He's lost a ton of business over the last 2 months because larger brokers have come in and slashed the rates to these customers, and they're getting trucks.
Oh, really?
It's the exact opposite of what the market data is telling us. And he's like, "Dan, I just don't understand." I go, "Really?" He says, "Yeah." He goes, like, and not by a bit, by hundreds of dollars a load. And he goes, "And I was making $150 profit." And he goes, "And one of my customers, they knocked $400 off the load." He goes, "What carriers are doing this?" And
is it intra-Canada?
No, it's actually inter-US. I know. And I said that much? He goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, how many miles?" And he says, "It's 1,700 miles. $400 off 1,700 mile loads."
I wonder if they're loading up the backhaul on the head haul rate. Like if it's dropping on the backhaul.
It has to be, I think, because you can't make money.
Yeah, do you know what lane it is? Because if it's dry van, I can pull it quickly.
I can get it for you. I can get the lanes for you for sure. Yeah.
So that's the thing. I talked to, we've talked about the Canadian market a lot. I talked to Chuck Snow from Traffics earlier this week. And I think he's been on your show, so people will know.
He's an amazing dude. I love Chuck. He's awesome.
Yeah. So he was saying that, because I was curious to see if the market had stabilized in Canada, and he offered a couple of thoughts. He said that the 20% of the drivers that we lost in February are still gone, like they're not crossing the border, so there is a driver issue. The thing he said that, and we see it in our data, load to truck ratios have stabilized. The LoadLink load index, LoadLink's our sister company, part of the Roper Technologies portfolio. It's the spot market in Canada, LoadLink. Their market has stabilized. He said, it's not the craziness has gone out of the market. There's capacity. When you look at the load to truck ratios, you can see that capacity has increased for the fourth straight month. Spot market, when you do your year-over-year comp, spot market volumes are way down as they are here. So he said there was stabilization in the market, but when we look at cross-border volumes, they've certainly dropped on the southbound lane, and they've also dropped on the northbound side. So there's less volume moving across the border. But the point that he made was the market has stabilized considerably from the cross-border protests that we talked about so much in February on a lot of those lanes. But some of the rates, Dan, some of those lanes that we looked at, there is still tight capacity on those lanes because there are fewer drivers wanting to cross the border. That still exists today.
Let's get to some of these. Good morning, Lisa. Good morning, Scott. Good to see you, brother. Good to see you. So Scott said great thoughts. I think I think that was from what Dean was talking about, or Jeff. Ryan says, "Morning, gents team. You're so right. We ignore any lanes that have volumes less than a certain number, 100%."
Right.
And that Ryan means when he's doing his RFPs.
Yeah.
We work with a huge 4PL that lost one of their biggest customers to another 4PL. It's unheard of. That's probably the costing that I was talking about. It's kind of, there's this flipping I'm seeing happening in the market that's actually contrary to what a lot of the data tells us, and it could be anomalies. I think it probably is anomalies, but one of the lanes was Arkansas to Texas that this company lost, and originally, I don't know if you guys remember, but same customer that we talked about a couple of months ago when the Houston port picked up, and all of a sudden there was huge numbers coming out of Houston and huge volumes. When we said anyone going to Houston, that number is going to drop, pay attention to it. I told them about the drawbridge coming down, and they didn't act on it. So that created an in for another broker. Same broker that came in, they might have 3 letters in their name, I don't know. Same broker that came in and cut the rates by hundreds of dollars. And it's interesting because you look at that and you start saying to yourself, when we're talking about contract rates coming down and spot markets and everything before it starts rising, as a salesperson, you need to get ahead of that. Like, you need to sit down with your customer, reevaluate and say, like, listen, here's where the market is. Here's where it's going to go. We can offer some kind of discount, because all you're doing is you're not allowing, especially if your customer is not like a John Brewer who stays on top of the market, who knows what's happening in the market. It's up to you, the professional, to get that information to your customer, because that's how your customer makes decisions. So even if it is a blip, because we have them all the time, Dean, you know that, right? Like, rates drop and then they come back. It's like it's a roller coaster. Hey, you know what? For the next 2 months, we're going to see rates drop. However, here's the flip side, and this is the real pro salesperson flip side. We can ask for reductions. Carriers' costs are up. I understand this hits you in your pocket, but we have 2 options. We risk losing the supplier that takes really good care of us because we're trying to drop $300 off a lane for 3 months before capacity tightens again and the rate goes up by $400. So do we bridge that gap and just call it even? We'll keep you in touch with the market, but you know, as a broker, maybe take $100 off your profit, just to give the customer something to give back. I remember when I was doing Dell Computer and Transcend Freight Systems was running my freight, they did all of my freight, and originally we were up like $600-700 a load profit, because they were like multi-million-dollar loads, and we knew one claim would wipe out our profit for an entire year, right? And I remember when costs started going up, when the exchange rate flipped from like $1.20 or $1.60 to $1.20, and all this other kind of stuff, craziness happened. I remember Transcend came back and said, we need more money. And I took it right out of my profit, to the point where I went from $600 down to $150 profit per load over the span of 2 years, because I didn't want to touch their operating ratio. I needed them to do the business. And you know what? In the end, that created a bigger partnership. These guys were running from hundreds of miles to make sure they picked loads up on time. Our service record was impeccable. And that's how we kept that business. So I would encourage a lot of you to start thinking in that manner, that this is a long-term thing.
Yes.
Long-term.
It's interesting that people can talk about dropping so much off a load price. You know, the inference there is that there was a lot more money in the load to start with, but I don't know that holds true.
That's true.
You know, so I mean, carriers on the other side are kind of our own worst enemies, right? Someone's hauling those loads, and that's what is not healthy for the industry. But if you play that game, that capacity is just going to bleed off. It'll disappear, just like it did in March and April this year, even into May. That was sort of when we saw the exodus of carriers out of the industry, when that diesel price crunch hit. When we look at DAT's network, that's when we saw the most churn in our business. But interestingly, capacity is coming back to the business now. So part of the reason people might be seeing rates drop on some of those lanes, Dan, is because we're adding more capacity. In July, the FMCSA data showed we added 9,000 more companies that got a DAT authorization. 27,000 trucks were added, which is kind of astounding. If you think about where we've come from, we had You know, diesel skyrocket. I think a lot of carriers just said, "I'm out. I can't afford this." Particularly the power only guys that were working for large companies pulling trailers around. There was a lot of demand for those. Because if you don't have your own trailer, then it becomes problematic as to how you make a living,
Right.
especially if you don't have your own authority.
Mhm.
So we are seeing carriers come back to our network and to the industry, which might tell you that maybe we've got a bit more supply of trucks than we have loads at the moment. But I think as we head into peak shipping season, and I mean that in the trucking sense, we're already at peak shipping season on the import side, but we will start to see, we're heading into the seasonality part of the year, right? Where you see Labor Day this coming weekend, Thanksgiving, Halloween, all of these, and then holiday season, all of these events require a lot of replenishment of freight into stores from distribution centers. There's a lot of freight going to move around the country. So that's where we see, you know, a fairly good end of the year, but I'm really, really worried about the start of next year. Q1 is always a quiet time of the year. We saw it this year, right? When we got through the madness of, will we have Christmas presents on the shelves this year? Or will we have food? Once we got past that, the wheels fell right off demand. I fear that once we get through the supply chain disruptions of this year, assuming that happens, and there's so much going on in the world that can throw a spanner in the works, or I think as you'd say, a wrench. Do you say wrench or spanner?
We say
Wrench.
wrench,
A wrench in the work.
yeah.
We call them spanners in Australia.
Same
Um,
thing.
right. So I'm more worried about the start of next year than anything else. I just think the first quarter of next year is going to be really, really tough. And as I said to some carriers on Chuck Snow last night, if I was running trucks right now, I'd have January, February, and even March's truck payments in the bank before the year ends.
See,
Right.
that's
make
what's going to kill people.
Yeah, I think that you'd be big payments. Like, so if you got tires or anything, I'd have all that put away right now, because I just think rates are going to, take a hammering. We don't know when this current cycle is going to bottom out. We know that spot rates and contract rates will bottom out sometime next year, and then the market's sort of off again. But that's kind of where we sit right now. I think this is a really interesting bid season, and there are going to be some pretty heavy negotiations going on, especially after shippers have had what must have been 6 to maybe 6 quarters of double-digit rate increases, since the pandemic started. And there is a definite sign that normality is returning to the freight market. When you look at freight volumes, they look very, very close to what they were in 2018, which of course was our last most normal freight year. It was a good year for carriers, but demand was pretty good also.
Do you remember, and I know we've said this before, Dean, the conference that I met you at for the TCA?
Yeah, right.
Where every single large trucking company was like, you cannot use 2018 as a benchmark. And now here we are, literally 4 years later, going, 2018 is the benchmark. That's where we are. Well, total flip in mental, crazy how that happens.
Isn't it funny how we go forward? We go through the pandemic, demand crashes in April 2020, and then next thing it takes off to the races for the best part of 18 months. And we think, well, heck, 2018 was incredibly normal compared to what we've just been through. But yes, I remember that only too well. There's no textbook for what we've been through.
No.
And we've been pretty honest with everybody, or very honest with everybody about what we see going on in the market. Most of the time we're right. We don't. I think there's some real challenges ahead for the industry, though. I think this is the fact that carriers are entering back into the industry is somewhat concerning. But the reason that we look at why carriers are coming back is there's a lot more technology at their disposal these days. So there's a lot more. You've got a lot more technology on your side. Both you and Jeff can see a lot more of the market. There's a lot more load visibility. There's a lot more market visibility, and carriers have a lot more technology to allow themselves to be to sustain themselves. So you've got a lot more features on apps these days. You can find loads, book loads. You can make sure you've got good weekly load utilization levels. I think the overall focus on operating costs has been a good thing this year. It's one of the good things that came out of skyrocketing diesel prices was, holy heck, what does it really cost to run a truck if diesel is $5 to $6 a gallon? And so everybody started talking about that. And of course, that's one of the positive things that came out for carriers is we better make sure we know our operating costs.
Yes.
True. It's interesting. So, Dean, I got a question for you. What do you see happening? The last time we saw an entrance like this into the market was 2018, and then obviously we all know what happened in 2019. It was one of the years where more carriers went out of business, and not just new people. Companies like Celadon and all these major players dropped out of the industry. Do you see something happening like that come Q1, Q2 next year, or how do you see
No, I
that
don't.
playing out?
I don't, Dan. The large truckload carriers have had one of the best. Certainly, last year was one of the best years they've ever had, and the first 6 months of this year have been even better. So when you look at the earnings calls of the large truckload carriers, they are doing really, really well. And so I think that's going to set them up for a pretty good, certainly the rest of this year and into next year. I don't see any downside in that regard. Same on the smaller carriers. They've had a pretty good run up until diesel prices went up. They've had a pretty good run also. So I think the difference this time around is there's a lot more, I think carriers have got a lot more equity, a lot more cash. They're doing much better this
The
time.
ones
So I
that are
don't see,
smart about it,
yeah,
obviously.
I don't see anything like we saw in 2019. We said that months ago when people were rabbity on about a purge and a bloodbath and all of that sort of madness. That made no sense to me, because I thought, heck, carriers just had their best year in 3 decades. How is that ever going to happen? Now, of course, some carriers did disappear because they were running close to the wind anyway when diesel prices came up. But that's always the case in a certain section of the market. But the industry is really healthy. So I just don't see that happening next year. There could be some mergers and acquisitions. Companies are pretty cashed up. There could be, I think you'll see a lot more companies trying to expand their reach into other parts of the supply chain. You're already seeing that with ocean carriers buying air cargo companies. So I could see more truckload carriers buying more final mile businesses, more warehouse space, controlling more aspects of the supply chain to ensure service levels. So that's definitely on the cards. I just don't see the downside of companies vanishing out of the industry last year. And remember, shippers are still paying record high prices to move freight because of the diesel surcharge at 64 cents. And also don't forget that some carriers make money off the diesel surcharge because they've got better MPG than what they factor in to the actual calculation.
And
So
they buy fuel at a different rate, and they
Right.
Pay for sure.
They're smart business people. That's good business. I don't begrudge anyone making a profit and making good business decisions. I sort of draw the line though at squeezing the small carrier and for margin expansion on the non-asset side for the sake of moving a load, because that's really short-term thinking if you think that carrier is going to be around longer term. And maybe that's just how it works, that when one guy goes out, there's always another one that comes in. So maybe that's just the sad part of supply and demand and the way the business works in the deregulated market.
As a broker, when I first got into this industry, one of the first comments somebody said to me is, somebody will move it at the price you want.
Yeah, I know.
And as disgusting as that is years down the road, when I think about it, it's true. And it's, as much as it is, there will be somebody out there now, whether it be somebody that doesn't understand their operating costs, somebody that's stuck and just needs to get their driver to another location and is being taken advantage of. And there's the flip side of it, right? There's always two sides to it. Friday afternoon, you have a carrier cancel on you as a broker. You're paying way more to get that freight taken care of, right? So there's always two sides to that story, which is why reverse engineered logistics start with your carriers, your top 5 to 10 carriers, and sell where they need freight is the smartest tool any broker can use to get a solid business that they can build a career and a life with, right? Really design their career over it. If you're starting with the shipper, you're not starting in the right spot. In my opinion, my professional opinion is, especially in a market like today, because everything we do as a broker is on the shoulders of our supplier. And so if you're taking that supplier that's stuck and squeezing them even more, they're going to be like, well, yeah, I'll get it done because I need to get home. But they're not getting it done to provide you value and add service to you. They're just not. They're saying, I'll get it done and get home. And then now it's pissed everybody off. And so if there's any blip in the entire process, it's like, well, I don't care.
Yeah.
My truck's home, your trailer's in the yard, and it went into bond. And, when we have to manifest it or whatever, then great. But it'll be on when I'm ready to do it, not when you want me to do it, because you just took advantage of me. And I think there's always going to be that in this industry. I don't think we can ever get away from it, because some brokers, sorry, let me rephrase that. Some salespeople that work at brokerage companies, because I don't think it's the logo. I think it's the people, and it might be the culture, the way they've been trained. That's very possible. I've never been at any of these. I only hear stories, but we all know broken telephone situation. So I think it's people that are trained like that. I know I was.
Yeah.
Whatever they say, tell them $50 less, because they, the thing was, carriers always raise it by $100 for brokers.
Right.
It's funny, because when I worked at Transcend, I asked the people that were pricing. They said, no. If we price a broker, we actually price them $100 less so they can make a profit. So it's interesting that brokers think carriers raise the price for them, when a lot of carriers are saying, well, no, if this broker gives me business, knock $50 off what we would charge a customer.
Right.
Like, we would literally knock $100, $150 off to what we would charge a customer direct or a broker. And
so
we did business with them all. We did business with Traffic. We did business with, American Group. We did business with them all.
Right. Do you think that this time around through the bid season that shippers will be acutely aware of how tight capacity was last year, and they'll be very careful not to avoid service failures in a critical part of the shipping year? I mean, that would be logical.
Mm-hmm. I would hope they have a whole different set of parameters on the RFPs. And, I've been writing notes down, Dean, when you've been talking, because to me, this is a huge part of what people do. Like, you look at Jeff, how much work Jeff has put into this RFP in the last week.
Right.
Jeff, I pray for you that you get business out of it, because otherwise it's a total wasted week when you could have made a sales call to meet that next great customer that loves you. And that for me was always the RFP conundrum. That for me was always the issues that came with RFPs, is I spend so much time on it. And then, I told you guys about the Schneider RFP, Schneider Electric. I did an RFP with them, and I had a whole RFP process. And I went in and they said, yes, no problem. And I quoted 17 lanes. On those 17 lanes, it was like 2,100 loads a year. And I was like, dude, that's enough. Like, I'm going to have to double my team in order to get that done. On the Friday, we were number one on the 17 lanes. And I got a letter saying we're number one. We're going into like literally the awards portion. So it's like, okay, this is done. And I was doing business with them. They were already a customer. On the Monday, I got a letter saying, sorry, we've had to pull you out of the bid. I'm like, what the hell? So I called the lady, and she says, well, we're reducing our carriers, like you talked about, reducing the core carriers, and the minimum lanes that we needed somebody to take was 20. I'm like, but it was never said in the RFP. And unfortunately, I didn't ask that question. What's the intention of the RFP? To reduce our carrier pool? Well, I'm going to go after 30 lanes. Like, I'm not going to go after 17. So because I didn't ask the question and they didn't have it anywhere in their documentation, we lost out, and we lost a serious amount of business.
Yeah, something, to get back to that RFP, and I've been doing this for a very, very long time. A lot of RFP consist of round 1, round 2, and round 3 on the negotiations, right? I don't do that. I don't do that at all, because the way that I have my relationships with my carriers, I said, listen, if you want part of this business, put your best foot forward coming out of the gate, because you know your business better than I and the operating ratio that you need to operate at. Okay. So when they put their bid in, and then I give them the unfortunate letter, sorry, thank you for your bid, but nothing's been awarded. What do you mean? Why didn't you talk to me? I could have done better. Did I not say this up front? So that's the issues that I have with a lot of carriers out there, is that why don't you put your best foot forward? If you want $10 million worth of business, I think you better put your best foot forward if you really want it. Because if you don't want it, you're not going to put your best foot forward. So that kind of decreases the amount of time that I spend on my RFPs, right? And the thing is that when I do them, I can knock them out rather quickly. I don't have to wait 3 months and everything because I have this format that I've created that makes it a little bit quicker. But the thing is also, and this is debatable, and I'll get into it. On the process of the RFP, you've got FSC and then you got the base rates. Okay, a lot of people, and I think it's unethical, is upcharge on the fuel surcharge. Okay,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
so
I
a
agree
fuel
with that.
surcharge.
I think if as a
Right.
broker, if you
But
put
the
one or
thing
two
is
points on, you're good.
yeah, but here's the thing, right? So logically, if the fuel is at 63 cents a mile, does it really matter? Because it's really not. If you're upcharging the fuel surcharge, it's not 63. It could be 79 cents because you're upping it by a margin percent on that. You know, it shouldn't be something that is made money on. That's just the way
Right.
I look at it because I feel strongly that it's unethical. It should be a complete pass-through. It's the base, and then it's the managing of the business. That's where you put your margins on there. So you have to be profitable. The company that you're doing business with has to be profitable. So it's that relationship. I tell them straight up front. This is what I'm going to do. You know, I got 201 lanes. I don't want them all. I tell them straight out. I said, I'm going to pick and choose the ones, and then we'll go over a cost plus program on that. And then if we have to massage, we'll massage it. Now, it's good when you have a business partner that knows you very, very well. That's how I pretty much got in the door. But those are the kind of conversations you have to have in order to do this kind of stuff. So
I love Jeff.
Jeff,
I love that you're doing cost plus. I love that.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, let me ask you about the carriers. I guess I'm not surprised that carriers would not put their best price in initially, even after you said that. That's kind of a little bit naive. But is there a size of carrier that enters into the RFP process? Is there a threshold where you're just too small? Or
well, of course. I mean, because during that RFP, I have that data that shows the frequency in which that lane moves on a monthly basis. And then I basically tell them, listen, if you're going to bid, you also have to provide the capacity that's needed in order to support the business. All right. Don't bid on the lane if you can't support it. I don't want to have this conversation down the road when something comes up and you can't take the load. Okay. That's the way that I deal with them. I mean, in short, I could go in a little bit deeper, but I won't. But those are the kind of conversations that you have to have part of the RFP process. You know, lay it on the line.
And you also got to do your due diligence, Jeff, because if you look on like SaferStat and you see a company that has 3 trucks and they're telling you they can do 25 loads a week, those numbers don't add up.
Well,
they
and here's
never
another
will when
thing.
it comes to ELDs and everything like that, right?
Yes,
So.
and you know something? It's unfortunate, and I found this, and thanks for bringing that up, Dan. Just because they're listed as 3 carriers, a lot of that information is not updated all the time, and they grow their fleet, and that 3 became 10 and 12 and 13. So just because they show 3 trucks, 5 trailers, doesn't mean anything unless you dig into them. And that's what I do. I dig into every single carrier. I make sure that they're approved first and foremost. And then I ask about their equipment, their fleet, you know, geography they like to work in. I mean, it's just a plethora of things that I ask to make sure that they're going to be in the right place at the right time in order to service not myself as a service provider, but my customer as well.
So you actually put your carrier through the same, I'm going to say ringer, but it's not ringer, like through the same qualification process that you would put your customer through. See, I love that. I think that's what needs to happen.
Well, that's part of the collaboration, right? Because you're trying to build a partnership. You don't want to mislead your carriers. You want to tell them straight up. And then the thing is, and which a lot of people don't, I've had sales reps come in and they said, well, you know what, this lane, it's not where we go, but you know what? We'll take it on to complement the account. Oh, no, you won't. You're not going to take this on. You know, they're running at 114% OR. I mean, they're losing money on it. I go, no, because overall, that's going to affect the account as a whole. Because when you look at everything and the profitability and the margins and all of that, that one lane can screw up everything. So I said, no, you're not going to take it. I'm going to find that niche carrier that goes in, let's say, the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, right, to take care of that, because a lot of carriers don't like to go up there for the obvious reasons. And so those are again, you have to know the industry and be able to have that conversations, and then ask. I've asked the carrier, why would you want to take this on? And I'd love to hear what they have to say, but it's just like, no, you're not doing me a favor, and you're surely not doing yourself a favor. So why would you do that? Have those conversations. Go deep, man. Go deep.
Jeff,
I love
so
that.
if I've got one truck and you've got a lane that needs one load a week, how do I find you? Like, how do I get involved in the RFP process if I'm a one-man band?
Well, I have a plethora of carriers that are approved that I can go out to. Carriers can always reach out to me, and they do. They said, hey, listen, I'm empty in Columbus, Ohio. I need a load down to X whatever. Oh, let me take a look, and then I get back to them, and then they remember that. Yeah, I mean, if you can help a carrier like that, they'll remember that, and then they'll want to get in your corral. And I always put the numbers down in my contacts, and I like, oh, this guy likes to go from A to B, And another thing, you were talking about flatbeds. Interesting enough, and I think you'd like this, Dean. I just got awarded some business coming out of Texas, going into Edmonton, Canada, and the fluctuation in rates that I saw. Right. And these are 20 to 30 loads a month. Anywhere between $1,000 to $1,700 difference in rates.
Yeah, there's a big there's something happening in the Edmonton, BC area, the Alberta, BC area, that is. I personally have not seen it like this in that bad of a situation, but Dean, it's funny. Dean, you just texted me about this same thing like 2 days ago, 3 days ago. It's crazy. I'm from everything from the people I've spoken to. It has something to do with the oil sands, the fact that there's not very much freight coming out of Edmonton. So anyone that's not based in Edmonton and Calgary and all these areas, they're like, there's no business coming out. So they're running empty hundreds of miles to pick stuff up. And if any of you watching and listening are running that area, please chime in with some information to help everybody. But based on what I was able to come up with was, I got no connections out there anymore because so many things have dried up and become just null. I got to turn around and run hundreds of miles down. And I want to be paid for it.
I got about 30 carriers in Edmonton that I could go out to, flatbed carriers, but not again, not a lot of them like to go into U.S. and want to stay up in the Canada area for the obvious reasons. But if they're that niche carrier, they're moving steel, as an example, they like that corridor. They like coming in Texas and up into Saskatchewan, AB on ON, all that area up there in Montreal. It really all depends on the carriers that you have in your little corral. That makes everything happen.
The answer to this question, Dan, was the oil prices above $70 a gallon a barrel means that that's break even in the oil sands apparently. And of course, with oil way north of that, they're reinvesting a lot more in infrastructure, drill pipe, casing, machinery. So that's why Houston's a big supplier of products to the energy industry. The funny part of the story was, when I talked to Chuck about it, was that when oil was really low, they weren't making any money. And this wasn't that long ago. They were obviously selling a lot of their steel for scrap. And of course, if you do that, then when things get hot, you've got to reinvest again. So part of it is related to the reemergence of the oil sands in terms of oil production. But I can't let Jeff get by without saying that I love the reference, the Three Amigos reference to plethora in there. That was pretty good. Do you know the movie, Three Amigos?
Oh yes, that was a great movie.
I love it when anyone can weave in plethora into any conversation. That takes a lot of skill. One of the great movies of all time.
It is one of the great movies of all time. It is.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that was awesome, boys. Any closing comments from anyone that we want to? Anything else we want to talk about real quick before we
I've
get
got
on?
one other observation. One of the things that CSCMP came out with the, I never remember what the acronym stands for, the Supply Chain Professionals conference coming up that we'll be attending and speaking at. One of the things they said recently was that the amount of freight moved on under dedicated increased 39% last year. And of course, that's a normal part of the market cycle. When freight rates get high, shippers look to curtail transportation costs by building more dedicated operations. That could be a for-hire carrier or a private fleet. But of course, when capacity loosens, the difference this time around, a lot of those dedicated contracts that were set up were shorter term. And so one of the things that could happen in the next market cycle is that, you know, the amount of dedicated operations start to go back to more normal levels where shippers maybe, you know, put their own private fleets in there to control service and cost. But I thought that was a pretty big number. And again, I hadn't seen it quantified, but there was a massive shift towards dedicated last year. And but again, we typically see that disappear or certainly decrease.
You know, it's when 2018, we saw more bids in the customers I was working with because I was already doing consulting then. And it was crazy the amount of customers that were in bids. Right. And they would bid. And because of the length of the RFP process, because shippers started putting out bids in like Q3, Q4, because they're like, this is crazy. A couple of companies in particular won millions of dollars in business, never got a stitch of freight, because by the time the RFP hit for starting, the spot market did this. So the customer just said, nope, go into the spot market. And
sorry, Dan.
No, go.
The other part that might support dedicated staying as a viable option is the fact that it gets drivers home fairly regularly, because the emerging generations of drivers want to be home more often. It's a much better lifestyle to work in a dedicated operation where you can be home either every night or every second or third night, depending on the length of haul. I think it's a viable
Cracker Jack loads where you have no idea what surprise you're going to get when you get to the border or whatever. Yeah, for sure. Well,
it was the way that JB Hunt turned their business around from the one-way network to fairly dedicated by looking at all of the lanes they ran where they saw repetitive patterns and turned them into dedicated lanes as opposed to one-way. So I think that could be a very interesting trend. The driver problem is not going away because it's a generational concern. And the lifestyle issue, the home work balance is ever so important. Drivers have never made more money, and they want to be home more often. That's a fact.
Real quick. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dean, but I think JB Hunt was one of the first that did regional, super regional, for that specific reason. About 30-something years ago, they started that. I think they were the first ones that did that.
They were.
That really started taking care of their drivers, so they would be able to have time at home.
I think it's everyone in the industry. Right. Like, I think everybody, if the pandemic has done one thing, it's taught people the value of what really matters in life. And I can tell you, going through the pandemic and then getting diagnosed with cancer, now more than ever, it's about what matters. And that is critical, and I think it's critical to drivers, it's critical to operations people, it's critical to salespeople. Like, I see more salespeople wanting to design their life now, as opposed to just like living 24/7, 365 with this thing attached to your bloody hip in logistics. And I think everybody's got the same philosophy. Is a great industry. You can make a lot of money as a driver, as an ops, as sales, but you got to design your life and have a life that you want to live over everything else. And that's the number one priority. And it is, because you think drivers are home more often and they're making more money than they've ever made.
Right.
Two massive things for mental health stability and everything like that. And, I think it's a good thing because it's going to bring younger people into the industry, which we notoriously have done a really BS job of bringing in a new era of drivers. And we saw that when COVID hit, all the old school drivers, a lot of them were like, I'm done. This is BS. I'm not dealing with this anymore. I'll go get a job at Walmart or Home Depot. You know what I mean? Like, and make just as much.
Here's my last comment on it. And it's just something to leave today's show on. Why does it always take a catastrophe to make change? I mean, when you think about it, why doesn't the industry look at the what if scenarios? I said it many times in my posts. If you've been in the industry a long time, why not look at the what if scenarios and how would you react if they happen to come up? Worst case scenarios, hope for the best. But it's just a shame that it takes a freaking catastrophe for somebody to get off their ass and do something about it. I mean, why aren't they doing
Jeff,
that?
I can tell you from personal experience, it's taken a catastrophe with my cancer for me to realize the true power of love.
There you go.
And I'm embarrassed about it, but I'm also very vocal about it, because that's where that is the power that overcomes anything. The power of love is the greatest power on the planet. There's no force on earth stronger. And
could not agree more.
When you love what you do, when you love serving your clients, and this goes beyond just making money.
It does.
Right? This is where your whole life changes when you put the power of love in front of everything. I love this show. I love it with my whole heart. Wednesdays are one of my favorite days.
Mine too.
If Dean didn't love what he did, he wouldn't be as good at it. If you didn't love what you do, you wouldn't be as good at it, and neither would I. But it's knowing that, experiencing it, and bringing it forward. When you have a supplier that loves making sure the value's there, your whole day goes better. Everything goes better.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
It's crazy, and it's just get in that mindset, everyone. The power of love is the greatest power on the planet.
Absolutely.
Greatest power.
Yes,
that's a good way to end.
It is. Awesome.
In trucking, our motto is people before profit. Today's market requires more transparency, consistency, and focus on what our clients need to win. Centurion Trucking and American Logistics are poised to help their clients achieve and surpass their targets. If you're looking for a team that honors your needs, dreams, and aspirations, then get a hold of Daman at American